Hi. I'm sorry about background noises. I am playing a movie right now to keep Caroline entertained, who is literally laying on me right here. I decided to come on here and talk about Edward's craniosynostosis. Yes, this diagnosis was 6 years ago. It is an ongoing thought in our minds, even to this day, because he will always have had his skull revised. I mean, he had major surgery at 6 months old. That was just 6 months into being parents, and that was the start of our family, really, 6 months into our family. A year and 6 months or something like that, a year and 8 months or something like that into our marriage. So it's interesting, fascinating bit of life. Sorry, I'm trying to get part of my arm and myself back here for a second, so that I'm not like leaning funny and feeling like, as long as I'm not really sure how long I'm going to talk about this. I will probably make more videos about this as questions are posed and answered. I am mainly making this because I have family and friends who still question about what that was that he had. I've had people come to me, and Joe has too, about, do you think this child looks like their head's the wrong shape or anything like that? And I have made some really awesome mom friends, like really long-term mom friends, through what I call the cranioverse. And it's just the universe in which we get ourselves sucked into when we talk about craniosynostosis. Craniosynostosis is a deformation of the skull, an infant's skull. There's so much information out there on it, but nothing talked about. There's a lot out there about it. It's not an unknown, but it is uncommon, and maybe misdiagnosed at times as positional plasia and other situations that it's not really what's going on. Oftentimes I hear that doctors are doing x-rays, which if you know how to read the x-rays will tell you. But if you're not looking at them right, because you can't look at them, from my understanding, as an x-ray, because you can't look at the sutures, but you have to look at how the rest of the skull is outlined, is from what I understand from the doctors that I've talked to who have, or nurses who have reviewed x-rays to diagnose craniosynostosis. Many of these individuals that I've talked to, and they're not just from one doctor's office or one hospital, and they're not from particularly Edward's treatment of craniosynostosis, they've been through many different ways, is that they're like, yeah, we get an x-ray and we have hints and signs that there might be craniosynostosis going on, and then we order a CT scan. The CT scan will show non-solidified bone. So it's still technically tissue, but it's solidifying fast. And the CT will show that. Caroline, don't stand on that. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm still momming too and making this video because, hey, my kids are kids and they're young and they're trying to injure themselves. They don't know it, but that's where it will lead. So the non-solidified but solidifying bone sometimes can pass as an open suture in an x-ray. It's not that x-rays are not well enough for it, it's just some people miss that, and that's a human aspect, and it doesn't impugn the doctor or the nurse or anybody. It just literally is easier to miss it on a x-ray than it is on a CT scan, and it can be missed on a CT scan. But not everybody who has craniosynostosis is born with the craniosynostosis evident. Meaning the head isn't misformed yet. The sutures aren't fully fused yet, or they're about to fuse and you didn't know that that genetic setup was there yet. It does happen within the infancy stage. Most, but not all, but most of the patients who have craniosynostosis are born, and it's pretty evident within the first month or two. Edward's was fused before birth. The ultrasound, either the tech didn't know what they were looking at, or it's not clear enough. Sometimes you can see it on an ultrasound because, again, you're looking at the outline, not the actual suture. But it's missed often there because a lot of ultrasound techs and people reviewing the ultrasounds aren't looking for it. Like, even if it's evident, they're not looking for it, so it's missed. And it's something that can be, you know, like I've had that question a lot. How didn't you know that he was going to be born with this? Like, how do you know? Did you find it in the ultrasound? No, but looking back at his ultrasounds, I can see that his head isn't round. That doesn't always show up as a red flag to people when reviewing ultrasounds. If you have a previous craniosynostosis child and then you're pregnant again, your second child or third child or whatever child after your pregnancy with a cranial kid, as we call them, or cranial warriors, that comes up a lot too. You can get, and I did get a lot of 4D ultrasounds with Caroline, where they would try to get around and see every inch of her skull and just rule it out because it was likely. It was likely, not like heavily likely. We were back at square one because we didn't, from the genetics testing that we've had done, which doesn't show it as a family trait. It shows that it just cropped up on Edward, and it's like, I think 20% or less than 20% possibility that he would have a cranial kid, because it wasn't showing up as a family issue. So, you know, that was that. But the ultrasounds did show it, but it wasn't severe. It wasn't very, like, when you know what you're looking at for the details, I could see that he had his head from front of skull to back crown, forehead to back crown. If looking at it aerially, bird's eye view, right here, kind of football shaped, without the points, but just this oval instead of round. And no one's head is perfectly round, but it's rounder. His was more oval. Because you have a soft spot here and a soft spot here, like back here. My ponytail's pretty much where the soft spot would be in the back. So you have a front and a posterior frontal, which is just the opening that is there to help the infant skull mold and also take hits, because what do babies do? They fall over a lot. They're learning to sit up, they're learning to walk, they're learning to stand, they're learning to move, they fall over, they hit their heads a lot. And that was actually, it's a design to protect the skull from cracking and protect the brain from too much injury, because everything is movable. Edward's, however, there's a suture that runs between the front fontanelle and the posterior fontanelle called the sagittal suture. His suture did not exist. It was actually a mountain range. No one's skull fuses in a mountain range. A suture should never be like that when fused. And his was. His people's should be like this. And some of our sutures technically never fuse. They touch, but they never fuse. They're always movable. So some kids have certain sutures that are fused that should never fuse in a human skull. It just should never fuse. Eddie's was pretty much, instead of like this, his was like this. And his was like this, essentially at birth. Like, I could see it. I could see this, like, dorky moment here. You know, in Star Trek, how they got those aliens that have that funny ridge down their forehead, which is oddly right at a suture. That's your metopic suture. That one does fuse before you're a year and a half, 2 years old. Usually before you're a year old, it is definitely touching, if not fused, but it will fuse for most people before a year and a half to 2 years. That one is another issue that some kids with craniosynostosis, those ones are born usually in their foreheads point. That's one of the more common ones. Sagittal and metopic are the more common craniosynostosis diagnoses. But Edward's sagittal suture through his, because he had not a stitch of hair, not a strand of hair on his head when he was born. I could see it through the skin. The skin bumped up. It was ridged enough that his skin actually bumped up over it. Like, it wasn't hidden under his derma. It wasn't something you had to feel for. You could see it. I questioned this, and a lot of people were trying, nurses and such, and this is what they really truly believed, because he was born vaginally. It took forever to get him out because his head wouldn't mold to come out. Now, retro thinking, looking back, you can see at 2020 that he literally couldn't come out the proper way. Like, he would have been a really quick birth had his head not been fused. Sorry if the camera gets shaky. I am literally holding my tripod still. She's moving about, so she will bump into it here or there. Eddie, I questioned a lot around his head his first month and was told, it's just molding and it will come down. But some of it did, and some of it where it did go away, I was pretty confident that was molding. He had a funny little lump off the back of his head, and I'm like, I've seen a lot of babies' heads, and they all kind of had a funny lump off the back, and it was soft. So I was like, but the top of his head was too flat for me, other than that ridge. Sorry, guys. She's getting into my purse. Yeah. 2-year-olds, they're fun. That just didn't feel right for me, that top bit. And that was the thing that I was questioning. I also questioned when he was born with the sagittal suture fused, the plates here, because you have like a sutures that run like this from your fontanelle, and then a suture like this, because your fontanelles aren't round. They're actually kind of like diamond shaped. So that's kind of cool to know too. This 2 plates, and a lot of kids overlap like this when they come out. This plate slides up over it to mold. It took forever for it to slide back out because it was caught on the fuse. And then when it did, his forehead bossed. Bossing is when it rounds out. Instead of going flat, it rounds out. And his was rounding out to the point that his eyebrows, I'll try to show you on myself, curved under. So his eyebrows were slowly going under his forehead. It was really weird. I don't really have any pictures of him. There's some in the background, but you can't see it close enough to see the bossing. Now, his head didn't boss as much as other kids, but it was bossed. It was bossed more than it should have been. A lot of infants' heads boss because your forehead doesn't flatten out and heighten until after your 2nd birthday. So, your face shifts into a child's face, and that's when your forehead kind of flattens out. No one's forehead is flat. That shouldn't be. But for Edward, his was literally like, it was almost like it was swollen out, but that was his skull. It wasn't swelling. That got me too, because that I noticed first. And then one day I was sitting on the floor with him around a month and a half, 2 months old. I was sitting on the floor with him doing belly time, tummy time. and he was fussing, and I realized when he laid his head down on its side, it was flush from eyebrow to crown, flush, flat. I couldn't see his ear at all. See, she's gonna get this camera. And I thought, oh, that's weird. He's got a really flat side to his head. So I watched that side, but then about an hour later, I noticed he was on his other side, and that was equally as flat. And I thought, oh, that's weird. Because I thought, oh, he's favoring one side. So he's flattening out his head. Everybody's talked about and been warned about positional plasia, you know, where the bones are too soft and they take up the shape that they lay in the most. And I thought, that's kind of weird. And he was a back sleeper. He liked back sleeping. And his back of his head never flattened out. It just kept getting pointier around. Like it did. Most babies' heads are kind of more flat in the back, like that. His was like that. And I couldn't understand why it was getting pointier off the back. And that was because his skull was trying to shape so that his brain had more room, because it couldn't get wider here. So what it did is it couldn't widen out this way. So it widened out like this. It literally got bigger that way. So this house is filled with baby dolls, and I can't even show you one because they're not in reach and they're not clothed, so it's kind of awkward. But so he had his head, I think I could reach her Barbie doll actually. It's not a baby's head, but what had happened was his forehead bossed out like that. It rounded right out, and his eyebrows stayed where they were, but the forehead came out. So he actually had like a visor over his eyes. And then the back of his head popped out. Instead of rounding out or flattening out like infants' heads do, the back of his head popped out. So he had a football shape. When you looked at his head, it was more football shaped like that. And in the back, it was really weird because like my fingers kind of really do what his head did. It's really, really weird because he got like these weird indents on the side of the back of his head because the skull wasn't deforming back there as much because it was kind of left to form in its way, but it was in the wrong place. I do have some pictures here that show you. This is the booklet that we were given by his cranial team talking about craniosynostosis. And the surgery specifically that is supposed to be. Normal infant skull looks like this. Here's the metopic suture I was talking about. Here are the sutures off the side. This is the suture he had fused. His was fused with a mountain range, as they call it, mountain range ridge. So that it's got a science name to it, but his sagittal synostosis was that the whole suture was ridged straight across, didn't have any flat points. This little bit of his crown stayed in the right shape. This bit elongated out, and this bit elongated forward to give, because this could not widen. And it gave him, and this illustration is sickly how his head was shaped. Just awful. See how I mean? He had like a visor. This is exactly how his head looked from the side. And the top, it looked like this. Though for him, he didn't even have this bit of rounding. It really tried to go flat on the sides. He literally looked like a football when you look. So that would be the back of his head. This part was more predominant for him. And this part was a little less predominant, but it did stick out like that. So he had this same shape. So he had this surgery.